Hi everyone, I'm your host, Sean Lee-Davies. I'm a filmmaker, entrepreneur, conservationist, and impact investor. And welcome to our Future Nature podcast. We aim to empower you with the insights and knowledge to navigate the increasingly complex landscape of tomorrow. So brace yourselves as we go on an exhilarating podcast adventure and dive deep into what it truly means to be human in the 21st century. We'll explore the critical issues of climate change, artificial intelligence, biohacking, and longevity, as well as other emerging threats to humanity. And we'll be interviewing the leading change makers, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs from around the world. Welcome to Our Future Nature. Let's get on with today's episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to Our Future Nature. Today, my guest is Christine Hebert, and she is the founder of Blue Lobster. Blue Lobster is a tech-based platform that connects low-impact fishermen with potential customers, creating a more direct supply chain where fishermen are fairly paid. Christine, thank you for joining us. Really honored to have you on the podcast. What inspired you to launch Blue Lobster? Because it's not your average app idea, is it?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. But yeah, basically, the concept came about a while ago. It arose at the end of 2018, and then we kind of started up really working at the beginning of 2020, end of 2019. So it's been a while. And I think we really just started looking at where the fish was coming from within the Copenhagen context, because that's where me and my co-founder are based. And I had spent some summers in Maine when I was growing up. I'm originally American. I'm still American. But I came to Denmark and I had this expectation that Denmark was a place with a lot of fish culture and there was going to be amazing fish. And that's mostly what I eat. So that's what I was looking for when I came here as a student. And I just found that what was in the grocery stores wasn't living up to my expectations, and there wasn't much variety and nothing looked very fresh. So me and my co-founder, we started digging into that, and we started going down to the harbors and talking to the fishermen. And I think we realized just how messed up the system here was, but it's definitely not unique to Denmark. It's a global problem that fish takes a really long time to get from the fishermen and the port where it's landed to the customer who ends up eating it. There's very little transparency. And what we found when we were talking to these little coastal fishermen around Copenhagen was that they're paid very little. And part of that is just because they don't have much autonomy over their own sales at the harbors. There's usually one or two buyers who comes down and buys from them. And it's often the auction system. So they don't have much say to choose which buyer they want to sell to. Price setting. It's basically they just get told how much they're going to get paid. And because of the really long supply chain, they end up getting paid a very small percentage of what the end customer pays, because the fish is transported. In the Danish context, it's transported to the other side of the country, it's auctioned off, and then it comes back again. And depending on where, how small or how remote the harbor is, it can be several days to sometimes a week between when the fish is picked up. And because the prices that they receive are based on the quality of the fish when it's sold and not when it's landed, that can have a really big impact on how much they're getting paid for the fish.
Right. So, yeah, I was getting that sense that you weren't approaching this as an environmentalist to start off with. It was more of we got to improve the way that this community can fish and make it more equitable for them. And then it's now morphed into more about ocean health and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we started, we didn't know much about how bad standard industrial fishing was. And it just happened that these small fishermen that we were talking to, they ended up being the sustainable fishermen. They're fishing mostly with just nets. They go out the night before, they set the nets, and then they'll come out the next morning and see what swam into their nets. So they're completely static gear. And they are competing against the industry standard, which is trawling and bottom trawling, that are just basically weighted nets that hang behind the boat, and then they drag along the ocean floor and they create these highways where the ecosystem and the biodiversity and the habitats of the fish and the mollusks and everything is just completely destroyed. And then I think it's definitely been a learning journey for us going along. So I think we started off, okay, it's bad with the biodiversity and we're killing fish, and these types of fishing methods are completely undiscerning. So they have a lot of bycatch that they don't mean to catch, and then those end up not getting used, and they weren't intended to be caught. And then I think even more recently, we've come into the CO2 issue, especially the top layer of the ocean soil is storing so much carbon that, they found out from a Nature article last year that by tilling up the soil from the bottom trawling, that they're emitting as much CO2 into the atmosphere as the entire flight industry. So maybe I think that has become like the forefront of why we need to move away from the industry standards. But it's definitely not where we started off with the company.
I mean, that's not very well known in the public domain, is it? That's a huge source of carbon being released into the atmosphere. Wow, I'm shocked. You know, when I think about deep sea trawling, I mean, as a scuba diver, as a free diver, it just breaks my heart to see how these nets literally, as you say, create highways of death or just destruction and leave nothing behind. It's just appalling. And for anyone who's ever seen it, they'll understand how disheartening it can be. So the problem with the ocean issues is that most of us just see the beautiful blue ocean and we think, oh, everything is fine, out of sight, out of mind. But of course, beneath the surface, there's all this kind of damage that's been wrought by the fishing industry. Now, it is a huge $150 billion global industry, and you are an independent startup. When you started this, did you really think that you could take this industry on?
I think we wanted to try. I mean, we were two students. Well, I had just graduated and Nemo was still a student. I think we want to help these specific fishermen, and then we hope that we can build a platform that grows into something more global. But I don't think we had any idea about the impact that the fishermen are having. And when I say small fishermen, it's not like they're going out and catching like 5 fish. They can catch like a ton every time they go up. So in between like 200 kilos and a ton of fish. So it's not like a very small amount. There is something we can do on a big level, especially once we start really sharing what's going on and people start spreading the word. And we've been lucky to get a lot of press around Denmark. I think we've educated a lot of people around here about the issues and how bad the standard kind of fishing is. I'm also a scuba diver, and I was diving with this guy from Bornholm, which is this little island around Denmark. And it used to be like fishing was the source of sustenance and economic viability for that island. And he just said over the course of these last 10, 20 years, it has gone from like a completely vibrant place with lots and lots of fish and life under the sea, and it's just nothing is left. And I think, yeah, you're totally right that when people think of the sea, they don't really have a good idea of what's going on underneath.
Mm. And most of that damage has been done because of industrial fishing practices, right? Just to be clear, like that's because we're overfishing and we're deep sea trawling, and basically just wipes out a fish stock so that they can't recover. And then the human communities therefore can't survive because there's no fish in the ocean in that community.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely that. And I think it's also partly the pollution that we're putting into the water. That's been a big issue around Copenhagen specifically. There's a lot of agricultural runoffs that are going straight into the ocean. And here we've really seen it with the cod population. At the beginning of the year, they dropped the cod quotas by 85% because the cod populations were struggling so much. So we basically should not be eating the cod around here, partly because the populations are really not doing well, and partly because there's a lot of pollution in the water, and it's just not healthy.
Our Future Nature is brought to you today by Authentic Gallery. Authentic Gallery makes buying and collecting stunning and impactful art easy, with a high percentage of proceeds going towards our vetted partner charities. If you want to buy art and contribute to an impactful cause, well, check out Authentic Gallery. That's spelled AWETHENTIC gallery.com. As a special treat to my listeners, you can use the discount code OFNPOD. That's OFNPOD to get a 10% discount off all of my limited edition prints. So check out Authentic Gallery and start browsing now. Thanks very much. Isn't the answer to just stop eating fish altogether and go vegan? What would you say to that?
It could be. It could be. I personally believe everything in moderation is how we should view everything that we eat and do. But I also think that it's not realistic to think that the world is going to stop eating fish. The step that's actually feasible is that we educate people and move them towards the right kind of fish. And we can be monitoring the amount of fish that we're pulling out of the sea and the populations. One big issue is that there's a lot of mis- and underreporting going on in the fishing industry. And that basically means we aren't doing a very good job of monitoring how much fish we're actually pulling out of the sea. So that's one thing that we're also doing at Blue Lobster. We've tapped into the ministry's reporting system here in Denmark, and we're in the process of connecting to the Swedish one as well, which basically means that every time a fish passes through our platform, we report it automatically into the quota counting system, so that we have an idea of how much we're pulling out. But yeah, I think in an ideal world, who knows, maybe if we could tell everybody to stop eating one thing or change their behavior, but changing consumers' behavior is such a journey. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And we don't have the time to go one by one and convince people to change what they're eating completely. I think it's more that we can nudge them in the right direction. And the fact is, if we stopped doing all of these unsustainable fishing practices and we stopped destroying the ocean, we could be eating some fish. Probably not at the level that we are now, but there is a way that we could be eating sustainably and fishing sustainably.
So tell us a little bit more about the app. It's called Blue Lobster. Everyone can download it, presumably, but it's presumably also targeted towards fishermen. So the average person wouldn't have much use for it. But why did you call it Blue Lobster? And then secondly, how do you actually monetize it? Like how does it support itself as a financial entity or a profit-making business?
Yeah. So it was just a story from my childhood that kind of stuck with me, and I had connected with this idea of purchasing directly from the fishermen. And it was that me and my dad, when I was a kid, we would go down to the docks in the summers in Maine, and we would buy the lobster directly from the fishermen. And these fishermen had caught a yellow lobster and a blue lobster, and they kind of kept them under the docks to show kids who would come down, because they're basically like an albino lobster. It's very rare. It's just a genetic modification, but they're kind of like blue and iridescent purpley in color. And then they have yellow ones that are kind of yellow and orange, but basically just rare lobsters. And they look really cool. So the fishermen would bring them out whenever kids would come down to the dock to see them. And that kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, that's a great name. And, it's a for-profit business that this company is that you started. So how does it make money? I mean, how does it sustain itself financially?
Yeah, so it's a double-sided marketplace, basically. So it's a lot of restaurants, some fishmongers, some wholesalers. We have a solution for private customers as well, but it goes through another step. But basically, the customers, they request what kind of fish they want. So they'll say, like, I want size 2 cod, which is 2 to 4 kilos per fish. And then they'll say how many kilos they want of it, and that goes into the fisherman's side of the app. So they basically just have a list of what's demanded, and it says which customer is requesting it. And then we do the logistics setup, and the fisherman does all the packing. So the fisherman will claim which fish species they think they're going to go out for, so that they are kind of holding on to that order. Then they'll go fishing. Then they'll put in what they actually caught, and then they'll pack it. They'll label it themselves. And we organize that the logistics comes to the harbor and brings it to the end customer. We started off owning our own logistics completely. Like, we had a facility here in Copenhagen up until last year, actually. We had drivers, packers. We were hiring some of the chefs that we worked with to do the filleting of the fish. And then we were driving it out to customers in our own van. But yeah, since the beginning of this year, we decided we wanted to step out of operations, and it had we kind of fell into it because we started up when COVID was starting up. So we didn't have volumes to be able to outsource anything. So we basically just decided we were going to do it ourselves. But now we're working with a lot of different logistics partners. So we're working with some in Sweden, some in Denmark, and then one that goes down into Germany as well.
You're 2 students, you come out of college, you see this problem, you're like, oh, we know nothing about fishing. We're going to start this app and we're going to operate our own fishing logistics. And you just basically figured it out. I mean, presumably you just got down there and started, transporting fish. I mean, it's quite a jump, isn't it? So you had no previous knowledge before going into this about anything about the fishing industry.
Nope, I was an avid fish eater. And that's, I would say that's it. And yeah.
Wow.
I think I was more of an avid eater than Mima was, and that was kind of our experience. But we have learned so much about all sorts of aspects of the fishing industry. I never thought I would have this much knowledge about fishing. But yeah.
And if you had your time again, would you have done it the same way? Knowing all the issues?
Like, would we start the company again?
Yeah.
Yes, I would. I think it was really valuable for us to get the knowledge that we did from owning the whole supply chain. But I'm really, really glad that we don't anymore. Like, there was a time when we just smell the fish all the time. Like, in Copenhagen, it's a lot of biking around. So I would be biking home and dogs would just really find it, like, they would just start sniffing me, trying to get off their owner's leash. And I had to like explain to the owners that it's because I worked with fish and not because I hadn't showered. And so I am very relieved that we no longer have to touch the fish. Yeah. But we also learned, I know how to fillet all sorts of different types of fish now. I know how to skin them. I know, like, we got into the nitty gritty, and actually, I think it gave us some credibility, like among the other wholesalers who are in the industry and the fishermen, that we know how to like pick up a fish. We know how to cut it. We know how to look for what makes it fresh. Like, are the eyes clear? Is it stiff? Is the flesh firm? Like, we have some hands-on knowledge from that. So no, maybe I wouldn't change it, but I'm glad that we don't do it anymore.
I think that's fair, but you're probably every dog's best friend in the city. But in terms of, you mentioned the fishing community has pretty much been very receptive to the app. Have you had any resistance from the community or the industry at large? Or is there anyone trying to oppose what you're doing, like the bigger fishing organizations, for example?
Yes, definitely. People don't like newcomers coming into an industry that is this old and established. I mean, the people who are in the fishing industry have been there for generations. It's been like someone who owns the local fishmonger, it was their grandfather or great-grandfather who started it. So there's a lot of, we do not want to change. And also the other thing is, everybody in the fishing industry, including the fishermen, are quite on the older side. So they've been doing this for a really long time. And I think with the fishermen, they were resistant at the beginning. They were like mad or anything. They just looked at us and were like, who are these young girls who don't know anything coming in and telling us they're going to come help us sell fish? And they were like, they can build an app. What? I don't believe it. But then we would start working with one fisherman at a harbor, and then the others would see how it was working. And then they'd be curious and they'd be like, I want to try too. So yeah, I think we ended up winning over the fishermen. But I think there have been people who were mad at us throughout the time. Whenever we go to a new harbor, we had something happen, like our boxes would get stolen the first time as like a sign, like, you're not welcome here. And then we kind of had to like ease into it. And we've also had some of the fishermen who are really promoting sustainability also get some pushback from the industry, because it makes the other fishermen look bad if we're going around saying this is the right way. So yeah, we had a langoustine fisherman who came in and was using traps. And he was actually an Irish guy who moved to Denmark to start trap fishing. And the industry really didn't like this because they've had this narrative that you can't fish economically, like you can't make a living by fishing with traps or pots. So like little cages that they just leave on the ground, and the langoustines, they crawl in and then they come and pick them up later. And yeah, the industry standard is that they're just trawling them up. But he was getting death threats over the radio when he was out, and the other fishermen were coming in and they were taking his traps up off the bottom when he would leave them. So yeah, there's definitely been some pushback. I think you're always going to have pushback when you come and do something that's totally different. And when you start saying that one part of the industry is sustainable and one isn't, you're going to have people who are mad at you. I think that's just something we've come to terms with. But yeah, going into the Swedish market, we haven't had a big opposition yet, but that's because sustainable practices are much more integrated into their fishing industry in general. They have a certain amount of quotas that are set aside that have to be caught with sustainable methods, for instance. And they have a bigger trawl border around. And I think it's just something that they talk about more, and it's something that the fishermen are very passionate about over there. Yeah, but there has been pushback, but that's to be expected.
And what's the incentive for the fishermen to use your app? Obviously, you're saving them money or giving them more of a marketplace to sell their fish. Presumably, they're making more money by using your app. That's the buy-in.
Yeah. They're making more money. They have to do a bit more work. Like they have to pack and label per restaurant instead of just leaving their fish and having the auction counted out or having another player like weigh out how many kilos of fish. So there's definitely a little bit more work to it. But yeah, they earn more. We make sure that they always earn more than they would any other way.
Fantastic. And just going through the different issues of commercial fishing and why it's so bad. According to the United Nations, over 90% of marine fish stocks are overexploited. And the four main issues, as we've discussed, bottom trawling, seabeds and destroying coral reefs. And then fishing gear. Let's talk about fishing gear. It's often left in the oceans. And by some estimates, there's enough, I've heard that there's enough fishing gear being left in the ocean each year to stretch to the moon and back, which is crazy. Again, is that something that your app can help address?
Not at the moment, but it's something that we could do in the future. The thing that we're doing is we're limiting which fishermen can be on our platform based on the equipment that they're using. And then there are some organizations around that are collecting fishing nets that are in the ocean. And part of the profits from the cookbook that we made will go to them. But it's not something that we've built into our system. We're just only working with fishermen who are using something called low impact fishing gear. And that's basically anything that doesn't damage the ocean. So it's a lot of it is static gear. So traps that sit on the floor of the ocean and then they'll come back the next day and pick them up, or nets that just hang. But then they can also there are some fishing methods that are active that don't damage the floor either. And that's like the pelagic trawl, which is a mid-level trawl. So it never comes near the ocean. And that's more for like schools of fish, like mackerel or herring. And it just comes and scoops it up in the middle. So it's in a deep part of the ocean. It's a net that hangs, but it's not weighted down and it doesn't touch the ocean floor, basically. And we're basically leaning up against, they're called low-impact fishing methods. But there's something called the Low-Impact Fishers of Europe, which is basically like an umbrella organization that has many sustainable unions within Europe. And they basically decided, okay, these fishing gear fall under the low impact method and these ones don't. And then there are many unions, like we have one in Denmark, there's one in Sweden that specifically focuses on fishermen who use low impact gear. And that is how we're limiting it. And we know that we do the reporting to the government, and the fisherman does as well, and then they match them. So that's one way that we're establishing, yes, this was how the fish was caught. And we know that it was caught sustainably. And we want to incentivize more fishermen to want to be able to fish with low impact gear by making sure that they get paid more. So, and actually it's a pretty easy step to go from being a small trawler to being a small net fisherman. They basically just take the trawl off the boat. They don't have to do anything else.
The third major issue of commercial fishing, of course, is unnecessary bycatch. And the WWF estimates that approximately 40% of fish catch worldwide is unintentionally caught and thrown back into the ocean. I think the numbers is quite staggering. 300,000 small whales and dolphins, 250,000 endangered loggerhead turtles, and critically endangered leatherback turtles, 300,000 seabirds, including 17 albatross species, just among some of the species that are caught. Of course, huge amount of sharks. Out of the 80 million or so sharks that are killed every year, a huge amount of those are killed through bycatch. So the commercial fishing industry has a lot to answer for in terms of, unwanted and unintentionally caught animals, which is then just wasted or thrown back into the ocean. So how can your app help sort of mitigate that?
Well, one thing is that when the fishermen are using these low-impact fishing methods, there just isn't as much bycatch. They have a lot more control over what they're going to catch. They're also not catching anything like that. The bycatch that they're catching is just like a different species. Like they're going for mackerel and they caught a cod. But I think one really important thing to note is that with the bottom trawling, especially when it's really at scale, is that when the fish comes up, they've been smushed in the nets and they're not alive anymore. But when the fishermen are pulling up their nets, the fish just swam in. Or when we're working with the langoustine fishermen, for instance, in Sweden, and they're catching with traps, they're pulling up each trap by itself. It's just sat on the floor. And then if there's like a langoustine that's too small, they can toss it back in and it can continue to live and they can catch it next season, basically. It's not a death, even if it's unintended bycatch. In Denmark, they're not supposed to be throwing up bycatch because it was intended for like the large fishermen who were fishing with bottom trawls, and it was so that they didn't catch lots of fish and then try to say, oh, I only caught what I intended to, and just toss the rest out, which just goes to waste. It was to control the quotas, but that's in the Danish context. So there are a lot of talks about whether that's the right thing for all kinds of fishermen. Like, should the small fishermen who have live fish that they didn't intend to catch be able to throw it back? And in Sweden, they can. Yeah, I guess those are the two things. Does the fish go to waste? Can it be used even if it wasn't intended? And then, is it a species that shouldn't have been caught in the first place because it's endangered? That's something that we don't really see here in Denmark. That's a big problem, definitely.
So, Christine, there's been quite a bit of controversy out there about the efficacy of these fishing standards such as MSC and ASC, which was brought to light in the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy. Do these marks or these standards actually make a difference, you think?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time looking at whether there were any standards that we could lean up against, because it would have been an easy way also to communicate on to customers, like, yes, this was caught sustainably or it wasn't. And what we found was there weren't any that we could lean up against. There's one that's come up in the Danish context, which is basically a mark that it was caught with sustainable gear and that it was the species that were deemed acceptable in the area, but it hasn't been successful so far. And that's mostly because the fishermen don't want to use it because it involves a lot more surveillance and a lot more reporting on their side. But yeah, I think that's the only one that we even considered leaning up against, because a lot of them, they don't mean anything. Like, there's a lot of boats that can get MSC certified, but they can also be bottom trawlers who get certified. The only requirement was that they improved since last year, for instance. So it doesn't mean anything. And that's also what we tell our customers, is that by going through us, the standard is it will be caught sustainably, it will be caught legally, it will be caught with low impact fishing methods. And that is the standard we lean up against. And no official mark is good enough, basically.
Fantastic. There's been a lot of talk about blockchain and the use of blockchain in transparency, accountability, auditing origins of, say, seafood and so forth. Do you imagine a world where one day a fisherman will catch a fish and basically mark it with a blockchain? Was it from seed to table? Basically, someone in a restaurant can see that fish that they're eating is from a sustainably caught fishery, as an example.
I've definitely heard about blockchain being used to track fish. I think one issue that we've seen is that the fishermen are just catching so much fish, it wouldn't be economical for them to tag every single fish. One thing that we had looked into was, can they mark the box? But then you have to ensure that box is going exactly to where it's going to, and that it's not going to be reopened. It's not going to be repacked. Like, there's so many things that could go wrong in that case. I think there's something there when it's like a really valuable fish. Like, there are these Norwegian king crabs, for instance, and they're worth a lot of money, and they do tag every single one. And in that case, I think it works. For us, it wasn't relevant because we're bringing it to the customer directly. So it's not passing through many hands. And we know that box that was packed by that fisherman is ending up at that restaurant because it doesn't go through anyone who could repack it. It's not going through a middleman. So it wouldn't be relevant for us. But if there was some way to track every fish, and it's going through many steps in the value chain, then I see the value. But I think it's too big of an ask, and it wouldn't make economic sense when it's like herring, for instance. Very small, cheap fish that there's no way somebody's going to They're taking a big box and they're dumping it into vinegar and they're pickling it. They're not going to check every single little stamp, and I don't think it would make sense for them to do it that way. For a private customer good that gets filleted on the boat and then packaged, and then a stamp gets put on and it never gets repacked, then I could see it being used for that as well. But it wouldn't make sense for our fishermen. But I think, luckily, we don't need to worry about it because we're making the direct connection. So we basically are ensuring that fish gets that one place because there's not much room for error in there.
Our Future Nature is also brought to you today by Authentic Journeys. Authentic Journeys brings together high-performing entrepreneurs, CEOs, leaders, and changemakers with ancient and modern modalities for intense personal growth to deeply align your individual and our collective purposes for positive change in the world. All of our trips are carbon offset, and we only partner with companies that have sustainable practices and credentials. Let us take you on a journey that will enrich your mind, body, and soul while helping the planet and local communities. Check out authenticjourneys.com, that's AWETHENTIC journeys.com, to learn more about our upcoming wellness experiences, travel adventures, and retreats to help you find your awe.
So we've touched upon the gargantuan problems facing the commercial and fishing industry. Is sustainable fishing actually even possible? Like, how are we going to fight back against the huge fishing conglomerates who send out these super trawlers and are processing hundreds of tons of fish? How are we going to get the industry to switch over to your model quicker? Well, how do you think your app will accelerate that change? Can it accelerate that change fast enough? I think a lot of it is educating the consumer, educating people about what's happening, why it's so bad. I don't think people even who saw Seaspiracy understand how bad it really is. I don't think he took into account the climate impact, for instance, which is just huge and crazy, and really nobody knows about it. So I think part of it is telling people. I think when people know the facts, and I think a lot of consumers are ready to make informed decisions if they have the right information. I think they're getting really confused by all the labels out there, and there's so many different aspects to look at. But I think people are willing to change if they have the information and they know what the right thing is to do. I think part of it is going to come from the government. I think it's easy to say in a place like Denmark where people are very rule abiding, but like already this year we've had a new trawl-free zone set out in the Danish seas, which basically is an area where trawl boats aren't allowed to go, and that is what the Danish government says. So in Denmark, they listen to it. I can imagine in other places they maybe don't necessarily listen to it, but I think that's part of our toolbox that we can use to change things. And yeah, I mean, I think one aspect is that maybe people just do need to eat less fish and they need to be more conscientious about it. And then, yeah, maybe fish farming in a sustainable way comes into play a bit to make up for the demand we can't be pulling from the ocean. We're working with mussel farms, for instance, but there are certain farming techniques that are just more sustainable than any kind of wild fishing. The mussels is a really good example of that. They grow on lines, they're cleaner meat, people like them more, and they don't damage the ocean in any way, as long as they're kept at a small scale. So I think that's one way we can supplement it. And then, yeah, just educating people about not eating the really bad fish and having some say over what we're doing. But I know that's easier said than done, and it's a big task. I mean, in essence, it's a very simple problem. We're basically overfishing the world's fish populations and are not allowing them to regenerate quick enough, right? If we just stopped eating them for a while and allowed them to regenerate, the stocks would replenish. It's quite a simple problem from that point of view. But the actual complexity of the problem from the economic, the industrial side to it is vastly complex, because you have communities to think about, livelihoods, and also fish, as we know, makes up a huge amount of protein intake for a lot of the world. Just taking inspiration here for some indigenous cultures, in the Philippines, the Tagbanwa people, excuse my pronunciation, have traditionally employed fishing practices to simultaneously harvest and then maintain the fish populations, basically doing what you talked about, like assigning areas where they can let the fish regenerate quicker, and then, working with essentially nature to let the fish regenerate. Can't we do that with our modern fishing practices? Like, can we not just help the fish along? Let them be? Maybe feed them?
Yeah, I think what we see is indigenous populations and small, poor communities, they're usually fishing in sustainable ways in general. Like they're using sustainable methods. I think the problem with the industry standard is they're not only overfishing, they're also destroying the ecosystems that the fish live in. So it's not like you can scrape over a coral reef and then leave it for a year or two and then come back and everything's going to be the same. We've already released all the CO2 in that carbon reserve, and we've destroyed the habitat that the fish are living in, and that's going to have an impact whether you leave it for 5 years or not. So I think it's a mix of, yes, keeping an eye on the population and not fishing where the fish populations aren't healthy. And right around here, there's basically almost a ban on cod, and that's so that the populations can regenerate. But yeah, it's also about not destroying things that can't be fixed by stepping away for a little while.
So disheartening, really, when you think about it. Can you just zone in on the climate impact of trawling again? Because this year, everyone's been talking about blue carbon and how actually it's the oceans that hold all our carbon. And you bring up a good point that deep sea trawling actually releases all the carbon at the bottom of the seabed. Can you talk a little bit more to that? Because I think for most people, that's quite surprising.
Yeah. I mean, the ocean is our biggest carbon sink in the world. And a lot of the carbon is stored in that first layer of soil. And that is what gets basically tilled up. It's just like tilling on an agricultural farm. They're tilling it up, and as they do that, they're releasing the CO2 that's been stored in that layer, that first layer of soil. And that will be very difficult to pull back down again. And it's there because it's been there for many, many, many years. And yeah, last year, this nature study found that it had been releasing more than the entire flight industry. And I don't know, it's just like people are monitoring and deciding, I don't want to emit any CO2, so I'm not going to fly. I'm going to only take a train everywhere I'm going to go this year. And that's going to make a big impact. We are actively opening up the biggest CO2 reserve on the planet just by eating fish that was caught with a bottom trawl. It's not knowledge. It's not really on the radar when countries are calculating their carbon footprint. It's relatively new knowledge, but we need to become aware of it. And I think people are finally grasping that CO2 and climate change are related, and we are having an impact on the world around us. But this is a big thing that is just now coming on the radar, and we need to educate people, and people need to know about it and react to it.
So we've talked a lot about the environmental issues for commercial fishing and what the benefits could be of changing the fishing model. What are the social benefits of shifting to a more sustainable global fishing model?
I mean, the shift is basically having more small boats and less big industrial boats. So, I mean, if we really did it on a global scale, we'd have more people employed. And yeah, I think there's also something that's kind of not really tangible about connecting to nature. And fish is the last food source that we're hunting, for our global food intake. We're not doing it with anything else. Meat and grain, it's all being farmed and cultivated. But with fish, we're actively going out and we're hunting it and bringing it back for people to eat on a global scale. So it's something that we have to really be conscientious about.
But I think the main question is, we've talked about the environmental impacts or the benefits of switching to a more sustainable fishing practice, but what are the main social benefits of shifting to a more sustainable global fishing model? Are the communities that use your app, are they happier? Are they, is it more equitable? Have you seen any benefits other than purely economical benefits or economic benefits?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that speaks the most to the fishermen is the economic benefit. I think we're kind of shifting the price of an unsustainable fish towards the price of, we're making it comparably that they can earn more by fishing sustainably compared to the standard. So one, they're going to be able to catch less fish to earn the same amount of money. And I think it generates more jobs by having smaller, sustainable vessels going out compared to these big boats. So there's more jobs, and I think it can really help like small rural fishing communities when we go into them, to give them autonomy over their sales, to give them access to more buyers. But yeah, a lot of it is the economic side that is the easiest sell to when we go out and talk to the fishermen, is that you will be able to earn more. Your fish, your product will be valued more. And you will have a say over whether you sell to this guy or this guy. You get to decide.
Now, a lot of people don't know this, but fishing is actually one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. And in the US alone, I think fishing and hunting has the highest occupational fatality rate of 132 fatal injuries per 100,000 workers. So when you watch those Nat Geo shows, the deadliest catch, that's what it's all about. Are you making, by encouraging more smaller fishing boats, are you making it more dangerous for fishing communities to go out there?
I don't know the stats about fatalities on bigger boats versus smaller boats. I think definitely it's a dangerous job. And I would never push somebody into being a fisherman if they didn't want to do that. It's definitely something that like speaks to their soul. And they crave going out. It's usually people who like their solitary time and they enjoy it. You wouldn't be a fisherman if you didn't enjoy it, if that kind of lifestyle wasn't what you wanted to be doing. So I think they know the risks when they get into it. And yeah, I wouldn't actively go and convince somebody who fishing doesn't speak to go and become a fisherman.
Would you encourage other entrepreneurs to create apps like your own to try and make fishing communities and fishing practices more sustainable?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have others that are popping up, and I think that's really nice. And I think it's really nice when we can kind of complement each other about how, like, which aspects of the value chain we want to take on. So yeah, like, well, we're working with a company here that's called Efficacy. That is like these drawers for people to go and pick up their produce, whatever that may be. So that is kind of one way we can enter the private customer market, is that put it in these like pickup points around Copenhagen, and then customers can go get them. And then, yeah, there's a company in Germany that is really focusing on the logistics of getting the sustainable fish out. So that's a partnership that we can work on, and that we can all kind of, I don't think there's any point of duplicating something that's already there. But I think a lot of companies in the space that we're in, they have a purpose to make the world a better place, and they are super happy to collaborate with others who are on a similar mission and find out, like, where is our niche? How can we work together? How can we get there faster? I don't think anyone going into this space is like, I want to become a billionaire. They're like, I want to make the world better. Oh, you're doing this. Let's work together. So yeah, I definitely think there's room for it, but let's not recreate the wheel. Let's find out what's out there, what we can already use, and what we can tap into and help each other out with.
So you're in Copenhagen, you're in Sweden. Is this something, this model, your app, can it be replicated, scaled globally? Like, could people in Asia be using your app? And what's stopping you from expanding?
I mean, I would say we are actively trying to expand. We're just starting up in Sweden now, so we're still waiting for the reporting aspect. But in places where we don't need to do the reporting as that first buyer, then it's just little tweaks, like tweaking the language, tweaking the species, tweaking the currency that's used. But yeah, I think now that we've stepped out of operations and now we don't need to own the entire supply chain from harbor to drop off at the customer, I think it's a much more scalable model. It's about finding like local transportation collaborations, giving the fishermen the packaging if they don't have the boxes. But for the most part, we're trying to use what they're already using. So just ask them to pack in whatever way they already are and put the label on. But yeah, it's definitely a scalable way to be doing this. But of course, there are like little cultural things, or does the app work in this context, or what would we need to change to make it like work for their setup? Like, for some places, they just sell fish. They don't even specify what species it is, for instance. So yeah, I think each case we need to see what the local context is and adapt it. But other than that, it's a fairly scalable model.
Licensees can come to you and say, hey, I'm from this country in Asia. We want to bring your app in and work on a partnership basis with you. Like, how are you going to operate in several different countries, or are you trying to operate from your central headquarters and just have little franchises?
We're automating all of the communication to the like we're tapping into the logistics, orderings, their setup, whatever it is. If they get an email, then we're automating an email. If they have an ordering system, then we're tapping into that. I think we don't even need to think of it as this totally separate operation in a new place. I think it's very useful to have people who are on the ground and know how things work. And then basically we need some funding to adapt the app to their context, basically. Right. And it's just these little tweaks. And who knows, maybe in some cases, there are bigger tweaks. But so far, like when we're looking to the UK, when we're looking to the Netherlands, when we're looking to Sweden, it's small things like updating the currencies and stuff. Fascinating.
Or maybe we can help out with some of that.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Are you fundraising at the moment?
Not at the moment. Yeah. At the moment, we've applied for some grants. Like we have one open to enter the UK market. Maybe at some point, and a bit later this year, we'll look to fundraising, but not at the moment.
So this year was the Lisbon UN Ocean Conference, and more than 150 member states made voluntary commitments to conserve and protect at least 30% of the global ocean within marine protected areas. So that's a pretty good sign. Is it enough? And are international communities or institutions like the UN doing enough to protect the oceans?
To be honest, I don't know what was entailed in the commitment, like what specifications it was. My impression of what the UN is doing, like that they're not focusing enough on the fishing methods. Like as far as I could see, that wasn't something that really came up at all when they are making videos about sustainability within fishing. It's about not leaving plastic in the ocean, or fishing nets in the ocean, which obviously is a big thing, but equally as big a thing is making sure that we're fishing in the right way. And I think that hasn't been enough part of the conversation.
Right. And we've talked about trying to reduce fishing. What we haven't mentioned, of course, is alternative proteins or sort of substitute foods. For example, new tuna, these, new brands which are plant-based replacements for the real thing, or cultivated versions of that fish. What do you think about these sort of plant-based or cell-based options versus eating the real thing?
I think there's so many aspects to looking to like fake meat about, is it sustainable and is it healthy for you, that it's such a complicated topic. I'm definitely open to the idea. I personally was mostly a vegetarian my whole life, and I love fake meat, and like that's one of my preferences food-wise is eating plant-based stuff. But I think when we're looking at the sustainability and is it better than fish, that there's so many complications to look into. I definitely think it can be a good alternative, and it can take some of the burden off of the sea. We need to figure out a proper way of vetting the solutions and understanding how exactly the fake meat is created, and where does it come from? How is it processed? How is it packaged? All of these things. But we've actually been talking to a fish alternative about having their products on our app as an alternative. Like when the weather is bad for fishing, for example, that we can push the chefs to using, they have a product called tunado, which is a tomato. It's just a tomato that's been, fermented and cured in a way that makes it look and taste like salmon or tuna. Obviously tuna. They're also a Copenhagen-based startup called Mimic. But yeah, we're open to it and we're looking at it. I think we're still trying to figure out all the nuances of how do you figure out if this is the right thing. But I think it could be a really valuable way to move consumers away from unsustainable fish when there's no sustainable fish being caught in particular. It's either that they eat frozen sustainable fish, or they don't have fish on the menu, or they find another alternative. And I think it could definitely be something there. Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting, as you say, way to relieve
take the burden off fish stocks, but it may not be a total replacement. So just finally, thanks so much, Christine, for your time. And just finally, just to talk a little bit about your Blue Lobster cookbook called Wildfisk. Is that the right pronunciation?
I couldn't do better.
Okay, there you go. I tried. I really tried. Tell us a little bit about the book and why people should buy it.
Yeah, so this was kind of a project that we did during the lockdown here. And it was basically, we collaborated with all the chefs from the restaurants around Copenhagen that we're working with. And we kind of gave them the challenge that basically, how do you make a recipe when you don't know what fish you're going to have? Or like, how do you be flexible in the kitchen? So basically, every single recipe that they had to come up with, they needed to be able to replace that fish, if it wasn't caught, with 2 other different species of fish that could also make the same dish, basically. So yeah, that was the kind of the concept. It was like 15. They're quite high-end chefs because Copenhagen is kind of like this foodie scene. But I think it was a fun way to spend the lockdown, and I think it came out really nice. We worked with another startup that does like food photography. So the pictures look really nice, and yeah, I think it's also just fun to be creative in the kitchen, and we kind of graded the recipes too. So like, some are really easy, anybody can make it. And then if you're like a more experienced home chef, which I think a lot of people were doing during the lockdown as well, was like experimenting, then they could go for like a more challenging dish. But I think it was a really fun little activity, and I think it turned out being a really nice cookbook. So
here we go.
This is Wildfisk. It is in Danish at the moment. But if there's enough demand for it in English, then we can have the publishers printed English version. And actually, we may be close to having enough demand already. Basically, it looks like this. And at the beginning, we're kind of like educating people on the different fish. So we like show like what they look like. We group them. So these are the tongues, or in English, it's sole. So it's the lemon sole and the Dover sole. So yeah, the beginning is just like showing people what the fish look like. Then we show them how to fillet the fish. So that's the cod. Now, and then we get into the recipes. And so
beautiful.
Basically, this recipe, for instance, was from a chef called Rita Chen, and it can be made with either turbo, brill, or halibut. Yeah, and then the thing is, it's a fairly simple cookbook. A lot of it is just pictures, so even people who don't speak Danish, they've been quite fine to follow along, following the pictures. And I think probably it helps if you know a little Danish, but hopefully we'll get an English version out soon as well.
Well, you can always use Google Translate or something, but how do I get my hands on one? On Amazon?
It's from a publisher called Mooseman, but probably it's on Amazon.
Okay. Well, I would love to.
Something I should know, huh?
You should know this if you're trying to sell a book.
You can get it through our website. That's one thing.
Okay, so Blue Lobster website, we can buy one. I'm going to buy one. So everyone who's listening, buy one of these books, encourage sustainable fishing practices, and eat locally fished fish from sustainable fisheries. And thank you for all the great work that you're doing, Christine. I think you're a great example of someone who just saw a problem and has just somehow just jumped in, learned totally new skills, learned about a new industry. And it sounds like you're making change and you're making a profit, which is the hardest thing to do, right? To do both. So really congratulations and inspiration to other impact entrepreneurs or green entrepreneurs.
Yeah, thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. And I hope we can, just offline, I hope we can maybe help with your expansion plans and partnership building, because this kind of technology and this platform be it's very much needed in Asia for sure. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot more fish demand, and
people know how to use fish a lot more in Asia.
Right.
Definitely.
Exactly. So we should definitely catch up offline. But thanks again, Christine, for your time, and congratulations on the great work that you've done. And we hope to catch you up soon, sometime in, I don't know, Copenhagen, Sweden. Maybe see you soon.
Let me know. All right, thank you.
And in the meantime, I'll be buying your book. Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in to Our Future Nature. Please remember to like and subscribe to keep up with the latest episodes. And if you enjoyed the podcast, it'd be really helpful if you could take a few minutes to leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please also follow us on Instagram and Threads at Our Future Nature Pod for behind the scenes and additional resources, or on X at OFN_podcast. That's OFN_podcast. You can find our social media pages on the podcast episode description. You can also follow me at Lee-Davies if you want to be updated on the work that I do in green entrepreneurship, advocacy, and conservation. And finally, Our Future Nature is powered by the team at Authentic Studio. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.